purely on the numbers, it's a pretty terrible business deal for the Australian taxpayer. But the government will go to great pains to emphasise that the deal is structured around loans and equity. And so the government is very confident that it will be making all of this money back and indeed making a profit on this investment. So it's not like we're just giving Telstra this money, but we are assuming some risk. We are assuming that Telstra is going to be able to actually run this business effectively in the Pacific, keep generating the profits that Digicel Pacific has generated in the last 15 years it's been operating in the Pacific, and actually give that return back to the taxpayer. So there is some risk here, but I guess the rewards of curbing China's interests in the telecommunications sector in the Pacific, and also getting Australian businesses back engaged in the Pacific, the opportunity there was worth the risk for the Australian government.
So in regards to China's rising influence in the Pacific, how much of that do you think factored into the government's decision-making?
Oh, massively. I mean, there's two parts to this. The first is to try and compete with China, to curb China, and to keep China out of critical services like telecommunications. And the other half is to also is factoring in China, is to try and get Australian businesses back into the game in the Pacific, because Chinese businesses have represented the real tip of the spear, the major part of their re-engagement into the region, and Australian businesses have really been absent as Australia is trying to be stepping back up in the Pacific and taking on Chinese interests.
So why didn't the Australian government just buy Digicel on its own? Why was there a need to get Telstra involved and pay it a subsidy essentially?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't think the Australian government is too interested in getting into telecommunications service delivery. We've already got the NBN, and there's enough problems going on over there. So I think a much better option is to get a corporate entity that has experience in this and provide them the right amount of incentives to get into the Pacific. I don't think this is a government that's too interested in this kind of expansions or creep of social services in that regard, and creating new state-owned enterprises. I just don't think that's in their DNA.
So, Jonathan, $1.3 billion from the federal government. That's a pretty big number compared to Australia's foreign aid program, isn't it?
Yeah, look, that is a larger number than Australia's aid program to the Pacific. Now, aid is a one-way transaction. We are giving that money to the Pacific. We're investing that money in the Pacific to improve development outcomes, whereas this is expected to be returned. But from my perspective, it's hard to think of a single investment made by the Australian government that comes anywhere close to that kind of figure in the Pacific in recent history. It's bigger than our annual aid budget. It's bigger than a lot of the other Pacific Step Up initiatives. It's bigger than our defence engagements. So it is a really significant move for Australia to be making. I don't think we can expect many more more than $1 billion deals up the sleeve of the Australian government. But there is risk here that it is setting some expectations with Australian businesses that if they want to go back into the Pacific, that the government's going to be there with a handout to help them along.
Okay, so this deal, according to you, doesn't seem to make economic sense. It's driven more by China anxiety factors, but it doesn't necessarily stop China from entering the market there, right?
Well, look, it will likely make economic sense if Telstra can run the business effectively, and the business is a cash-generating business in the Pacific at the moment. So it's not like it's a dud. But there would have been, on the economics of it is a real question as to why Australia had to chip in so much equity and so much of the sale price. In terms of, does it stop China getting into the telecommunications sector in the Pacific? No, but it does dramatically increase the cost for China to get into the telecommunications sector. Digicel has a very strong market position in the Pacific. It doesn't have a monopoly, but it has a very dominant market share in many of the Pacific economies. And so if China were now interested in getting into telecommunications service provision in the Pacific, it would need to look to set up its own entity or buy a more junior service provider in the region and stand up its own network, which would all come at a significant cost.
So do you have any idea what kind of return on investment the Australian population will get out of this deal?
Well, hopefully we can get to a net zero position, if you will, like where we do recoup the investment, the cost of the investment. But the government has said that they're going to make a profit off this. But it all really comes back down to, can Telstra actually manage Digicel effectively in the Pacific? The Pacific is a very, very different jurisdiction than operating domestically here in Australia. They're going to try and keep, I guess, a lot of the pieces in place of Digicel Pacific. It's going to be spun off into its own entity, so mitigating Telstra's risk even further. But it all centres on, can Telstra actually run a Pacific telecommunications service provider?